The Classical Style by Charles Roson.
Beethoven, 1. Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the greatest composers of all time. But did you know that towards the end of his life, he felt isolated and unappreciated in Vienna? Despite this, Beethoven was universally accepted as the greatest living composer of his time. His music, however, was no longer a vital force in the generations that followed him. Many composers, like Mendelssohn and Brahms, tried to emulate his style, leading only to awkward results. Others, like Chopin, succeeded in being completely free from his spell. Beethoven transformed the musical tradition he was born into, but he never challenged its validity. He venerated Mozart and Haydn and never abandoned their forms and techniques. The changes in musical styles between generations are pretexts for revolutionaries. Beethoven never challenged the validity of the past, but he transformed it. Beethoven's early influences. Beethoven's early works show the influence of his predecessors, Haydn and Mozart. His technique and spirit were closer to Hummel, Weber, and Clementi than Haydn and Mozart. The first movement of the Piano Sonata, Op. 2 No. 3, has a rigid sectional structure and a wealth of connecting material. This is not typically found in Haydn or Mozart's works. Beethoven's early works often lost the equilibrium between harmonic and thematic development. Thematic contrast and transformation were more important. Beethoven's early song Adelaide is a good example of Italian romantic opera. The long, winding melody, colorful modulations, and simple accompaniment could come from an early work of Bellini. Beethoven's technical mastery of the reproductive style was often underestimated. As a young man, he was already the greatest of its practitioners. Gradually, Beethoven returned to more classical conceptions. With the Appassionata, he set himself firmly against late classicism and early romanticism. Beethoven expanded the closed, concise, and dramatic forms of Haydn and Mozart, heightening their power without betraying their proportions. This marked his evolution as a composer. Beethoven's tonal innovations. Beethoven's compositions were marked by his attempts to find substitutes for the dominant in the classical tonic-dominant-polar relation. In his early works, he established a succession of tonalities, typical of the additive forms of his contemporaries. He later turned to a more cohesive scheme, venturing to dispense with the dominant as a secondary tonality altogether. After the Waldstein Sonata, Beethoven frequently used the remote mediant and submediant keys. The imaginative resources Beethoven calls upon in the use of these substitute dominants are astonishing. Beethoven's harmonic freedom differs from that of the Romantic period, as his secondary tonalities represent greater tension and imperative need for resolution. Beethoven's use of tonalities in his compositions paved the way for future innovations in music. Beethoven's harmonic structure. Beethoven expanded the classical language's harmonic range, without infringing on the tonic-dominant polarity or classical movement towards a greater tension away from the tonic. His secondary tonalities, mediants and submediants, function within the large structure as true dominants. Beethoven's harmonic practice heightened the dramatic expressiveness of his style, which depended on the contradiction and its harmonious resolution. His innovations took place easily and comfortably within the sonata style. While the Romantic period still used the tonic-dominant relationship, it was no longer the exclusive central principle of long-range harmonic movement. The great harmonic innovations of the Romantics came from Hummel, Weber, Field, and Schubert, and Italian opera. Beethoven's unconventional style. Beethoven's music often had a moral earnestness more typical of post-revolution Europe. His autobiographical approach was unheard of before 1790. He deliberately wrote difficult music, challenging both performers and audience. His fame and love were considerable, but his music was not always understood. Beethoven's return to the classical style was a departure from his contemporaries. He had a special contempt for Rossini, whose thoughtless work was exasperating. Beethoven's music was the result of unparalleled meditation and labor, unlike Rossini's. His difficult work was a testimony to his talent and dedication. Beethoven also respected both Weber and Schubert, although his admiration for the latter is not well attested. He was known to be selective in his appreciation of other composers. Interestingly, Beethoven was not a fan of the newly arising Romantic style. He once remarked that Spar's music was too rich in dissonances, which marred the pleasure of his music. This shows how deep was his lack of sympathy with the Romantic style. Beethoven preferred a diatonic framework and resolved chromaticism in his music.